Okay, well, welcome everybody to this. It's a joint meeting of the Hellenic and Roman Societies. Very nice to be able to say that and to actually be able to do something interesting on a Zoom call. And our topic today is something in a way that's all too familiar to most of us after the past year. That is living at home. But domesticity and the associations of the home are really interesting topics. And we have three speakers today who are all in different ways experts in different aspects of this. And we start with Zosia Archibald, University of Liverpool, who is a world authority on the archaeology and history of Thrace and Macedonia and northern Greece, and also has been working on the Olynthos project, and is going to be speaking about that today. She has published, of course, many very important works on the archaeology and history of Olynthos, and as part of the project and the reports of this project have been serially published in the Annual of the British School at Athens 2017 and this year 2020. She is also now has been associated for a couple of decades with the excavations at the site Vetren, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Sorry, I've lost my place. And has written about this in a very important work, The Ancient Economies of the Northern Aegean, 5th to 1st centuries BC, published in 2013. And a new volume on Pistyros, which is the ancient name of Vetren, which is in central Bulgaria, will appear in the next couple of years. It's going to press in 2021 this year. But today she's going to be speaking on the domestic and the political, domesticity, private and public spaces at Olynthos in the light of recent field research. So over to you, Zosia.
Thank you, Tim. I hope everybody can see my screen.
Yeah, could I just butt in and say, anybody who wants to ask a question at any point, use the Q&A, please, box at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to, just to say, Paul Cartledge, I'm going to be fielding the questions session at the end. We're going to wait until all three speakers have spoken. Thank you very much. Sorry to butt in.
No, thank you, Paul. Sorry, I knew I was going to forget something. Thank you.
The thesis of this paper is that the domestic and the political dimensions of ancient societies of the pre-imperial Roman world were more closely intertwined than we are in the habit of conceiving them. In the Greek-speaking regions of Magna Graecia and in the Aegean area, the evident division of civic areas into public, cultic, and private spaces, a division reinforced in public documents and decrees, horoi and other boundary markers, has separated off residential quarters, almost by default, from public areas in the scholarly mind. For the modern scholar, residential districts lack the architectural and epigraphic distinctiveness that public spaces have, unless they're punctuated in material form by such markers as in the Piraeus at Athens or by deeds of sale. and the comparatively poor survival of domestic structures as compared with public monuments means that different approaches have been applied to the analysis of houses and housing, as compared with the study and analysis of public spaces and monuments. During a recent 6-year field project at ancient Olynthos, a great deal of systematic data has been collected, which offers a more precise, high-resolution panorama of the city's layout and architectural organization, including new data about residential accommodation, as well as what we believe to be public spaces. This builds on the work carried out in the late 1920s and 1930s by David Moore Robinson's team from Johns Hopkins University. At the same time, the new data enables us for the first time to consider how the documented residential areas were created and built. Much of the recent research on ancient Greek and related houses and housing has concentrated on the organization of interior space, the distribution of artifacts in designated spaces, and the behavioral associations of these spaces, the preparation of food, execution of domestic crafts and dining or symposia. The Olynthos project is delivering new bioarchaeological data, which will, for the first time, tell us about food consumption and preparation. In this paper, I want to focus on the evidence that we now dispose of for the planning and construction of insulae and individual houses. By calculating the resources needed to construct one house and one insula, we can begin to understand the extraordinary logistics of house building. In the case of Olynthos, the exploitation of resources and the construction of houses is not just a matter of civic expansion, but of Macedonian royal strategy in relation to communities in the Halkidic Peninsula. Before we consider the evidence from Olynthos, I would like to consider the many facets that we can identify in the construction and destruction of one of the most famous houses from classical antiquity, namely Cicero's house on the Palatine Hill. The complex interweaving of the private and the public in Republican Roman society are graphically illustrated in this celebrated example. The picture that Cicero paints in the second sentence of his speech to the Senate, and I hope you can all see this on the screen, in which he claims that the homes and hearths of Romans are entrusted to the care of the priesthood and of the Senate fathers, may be a culturally and chronologically specific interweaving of roles and interventions that we do not expect to find in other Eurasian communities, whose customary rules were different. Nevertheless, the value of the orator's words lie in the fact that what Cicero presents to his audience is a cameo of what I would describe as the socio-economic dynamics of late Republican Roman house building. Cicero deploys tradition, values, as well as law in his argument in order to reclaim the property that he had once owned. Concealed behind this facade of right thinking are the rivalries of top politicians, the enormous financial and social stakes that they risked in selecting properties at the heart of Rome, as well as the capital needed to create such property. These deeper ramifications, behind these deeper ramifications lie the builders, decorators, and an army of specialists. And these have to be excavated from the other kinds of evidence, historical or material. My task today is to sketch an analogous model of the socio-economic dynamics of 5th and 4th century BC house building at Olynthos. What kinds of tools can we assemble in order to put together a model of socio-economic dynamics? If we look at rhetoric, then we will find nothing in Demosthenes' Olympiac orations about houses or housing. There is nevertheless a promising sliver of evidence in the Demosthenic corpus, namely speech 13 on organization, perisyntaxios. Although there are problems with its dating, sections of the text repeat passages from the third Olympiac oration. So the original context of many passages does seem to date from the 350s BC. The orator was deliberately referring to the housing boom of the first half of the 4th century BC, a boom in which the excavated houses at Olynthos are directly implicated. David Moore Robinson's team succeeded in revealing the outlines and residential contents of at least 50 complete domestic units, and parts of another 50, making the north and south hills of Olynthos the largest collection of data on classical residential accommodation in the Aegean. The new Olynthos project between 2014 and 2019, co-directed by Lisa Nevitt from the University of Michigan, Bettina Tsigarida on behalf of the Greek Archaeological Service, and myself for the University of Liverpool, is a collaboration, a sun ergasia, under the auspices of the British School at Athens and the Greek Archaeological Service. The aims of the project are to explore the spatial organization of the city within an 8-kilometer square area, at civic level, at the level of the neighborhood, as well as of the individual household unit, using a wide range of contemporary scientific techniques. Robinson's team excavated 7.5 hectares, or approximately 15% of the estimated area of the Astu, the built-up city centre. The new project has surveyed at least 50% of the area by surface collection, and 23.5 hectares, that is more than 3 times the area explored by the Johns Hopkins team, using a range of techniques, including geophysical and intensive survey. As a result, we can be more confident about the density and scope of residential and non-residential areas, about the probable location of an agora, the eastern extension of the mud brick fortification wall, and about the complex history of the South Hill, which was continuously occupied from the 8th to the mid-4th century BC. The houses of Olynthos, excavated by the Johns Hopkins University team, were published in volumes 2 for the South Hill and 8, the Hellenic House, of the monograph series on Olynthos. The picture that emerged was more coherent for the North Hill, whether Johns Hopkins team found it easier to manage and interpret data. Information about the contents of house units was used selectively in Robinson's final publications. Nicholas Cahill and Lisa Nevitt both made use of the unpublished notebooks collected by David Moore Robinson, which contained much more detail about the excavation process and about finds in individual houses. Cahill used the evidence of residential finds as well as the form and disposition of rooms in his 2002 book, Household and City Organization at Olynthos, in order to analyze how houses on the North Hill were built, to suggest some of the ways in which the insulae were constructed and individual residences selected. Meanwhile, my co-director, Bettina Tsigarida, and the renowned architect of the Galerius complex in Thessaloniki, Fanny Athanasiou, used all of these resources in their conservation of one large block of houses on the North Hill, acquiring much useful new information. And this is the area of the slide which represents a large white rectangle on the left-hand side of this slide. The architectural integrity of the insulae, each of which comprises 10 houses built in 2 rows with a common external back wall, makes it clear that groups of owner-occupiers must have agreed in advance how rooms would be disposed, because each row incorporates a shared cross wall, constituting the line of the shared ridge beam, and a shared central wall supporting the southern end of the roof, on mud brick walls as well as stone and wooden pillars. Nicholas Cahill came to the conclusion, on the basis of the Johns Hopkins University data, that the insulae were built by families themselves. If he had the benefit of the new data, he might well agree with us that this is highly unlikely. Owner-occupiers were probably involved in the choice of the overall layout of house interiors, particularly in the southern part, which was less dependent on shared structural features. Nevertheless, almost everything about the design and construction of insulae, including the shared drainage passage separating each double row, the mutual cooperation needed to ensure that party walls were secure, and the specialist skills required to construct each component part. Wall foundations, mud brick superstructure, ensure stability of the various pillars and other interior features, as well as mortared and mosaic floors, argues for a complex management structure for the organization of building. The stone wall foundations of each house were little more than 30 centimeters in height. Above was a superstructure of mud brick. The preparation of mud bricks involves a range of specialized tasks and preparatory processes, as well as seasonal requirements. Once prepared, the bricks must be transported from their place of origin to the eventual location, a task that required carts and pack animals in large numbers. Once we start to calculate the requirements of tools and equipment, wood for beams and pillars, as well as the quantity of mud brick required to build at least one story, we can begin to understand that the construction of several insulae would have involved the work not just of dozens, but perhaps hundreds of people over several years. The slide shows some preparatory calculations estimated for some 50 or 60 house units. The construction of several insulae on the North Hill alone implies a management structure, the provision of a wide range of specialist workers, carpenters and metalsmiths, as well as masons and painters. In fact, a whole army of building personnel, to say nothing of geonomoi, architects and planners. The most astonishing thing about the expansion of Olynthos is the speed at which these plans were put into effect. Rapid urbanization on this scale required resource. It is likely that Perdiccas II of Macedon not only offered land to new Chalcidian settlers as an incentive, but also some of the specialist personnel, perhaps at his own cost. And I include here the reference in Book 1 of Thucydides, which tells us about Perdiccas's incentives. The Olynthos project, In order to get an idea of the actual quantities used in construction, my colleague at Liverpool, Matthew Fitzjohn, has used Lego house units to try out some of the options that owner-occupiers may have selected, particularly on the upper story. A complete upper story, one upper wing or two wings. These house designs were originally developed as a teaching aid for primary children to learn about Olynthean housing. But they also help to refine our ideas about the quantification of materials, as well as the range of building options. The need to develop a civic architecture rapidly also inspired innovation. Olynthos is one of a small number of sites in southeastern Europe where baked bricks were used during the course of the 4th century, a technique that spread westwards thereafter. It is a pleasure, incidentally, to be able to include here a reference to the other site with which I have had a long association, namely Pistyros. The Olynthos project is helping us to understand more clearly just how much of the task of city building is due to a range of cooperative processes. And this is what constitutes the socio-economic dynamics of 4th century BC Olynthos. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zosia. That was a really interesting survey of a project that, I mean, it's interesting as a sort of methodological effort in the way in which you have gone back to a site that was explored so systematically and famously back in the 1930s to go back to that and then to use new methods to survey not only the stuff that was done before, but also whole new areas. I think we should, Paul, I don't know if you agree with this, save questions until all three speakers have finished.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So with that, I think we should thank Zosia very much, and then we'll come back to the discussion of this interesting paper at the end. And move on to our second speaker, Julia Hillner, who is at the University of Sheffield, although I gather today speaking from Manchester. Julia is very well known as a scholar of the later Roman Empire, has worked a lot on Roman law and has written on punishment in late Roman legal texts. but also has written on women in late antiquity and the Middle Ages, and also more generally on the family and the household. One of her most famous pieces, actually, from some years ago, was an article on Domus, family and inheritance in the Journal of Roman Studies, which I, of course, have to mention, back in 2003. But generally on the family and the household unit in late Rome, and she's going to speak today about her title, Jewels, a Forgotten Category of Roman Women's Property Portfolio. So over to you, Julia. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, this is returning a little bit to the JRS context of, you know, property and inheritance and so on. I haven't forgotten about it. Thank you so much for having me and letting me speak at this wonderful event. Before I start, I would like to thank two people who have inspired this paper with their work. One is Dr. Maureen McCarran at the University College of Cork, who works on women in early medieval Britain. This will become obvious why in a moment. And the other one is Dr. Mike Patzold from the University of Osnabrück, who works on widows in the later Roman Empire. Now, the relationship between women and Jewry in the Roman world has obviously not been ignored at all. Gender historians have done superb work on the dissonance between the economic desirability of precious objects, including by men, and their symbolic value as negative emblems of excess, immorality, and foreignness. And that's wonderful work. And also there's a lot of work on what the dissonance, this dissonance tells us about how the Roman body was gendered. But the scholarship has really concentrated on the wearing of jewelry and the politics around wearing of jewelry. And what has been less looked at, I think, is the question who actually owned jewels that these moralizing voices talk about. And I distinguish between ownership, which includes the right to freely sell, donate, or bequeath from things like possession, who physically had jewels at any given time, or right of use. And these distinctions are important because I want to illustrate that with a recent case that has gripped the British media, the case of the earrings that were given to Meghan Markle by the Saudi crown prince after, well, she wore them after the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. That has generated some interest. And what it has shown is that there are huge questions in this case about whether she owned these jewels or whether they were a gift to her or whether she had borrowed them. And so who had control over her wearing them? And I think that is a really interesting question. I actually had a picture of Meghan Markle as well, but I've realized that it's a very emotional subject at the moment, so I don't want to actually dwell on it longer. So ownership of jewels mattered in Roman times too, is my point. And scholarship on female property in the Roman world has generally concentrated on establishing whether Roman women, by which I mean free citizen women, by the way, owned land, which is considered the prime type of Roman property. If so, how much they owned, how they acquired it, how they used it, and so on. And there's also scholarship on whether women ran businesses and engaged in trade and so on. All this is sometimes classed as thinking beyond the so-called mundus muliebris. Now, this is a term that floats around Latin literature and Roman law and modern scholarship as well, designating objects that serve the beautification of women. There's a tendency in modern scholarship to include women's jewelry in mundus muliebris alongside toiletries and the like. And by extension, it's therefore often deemed a less important type of property. Now, Roman jurists found it equally hard to define what mundus muliebris meant, but with exceptions, they distinguished it from jewelry, which they call more precisely ornamenta, which is what you see here on your slide. Partly they did this because of value, partly on cultural grounds, because jewels were considered to be for adorning the body and not cleaning the body. And it's worth following the jurist's lead, I think, and reinsert discussions of jewelry into kind of discussions of Roman women's patrimony. Now, ownership of jewelry is not an easy thing to establish. Literary sources are often ambiguous, sometimes deliberately so, and material evidence of Roman jewelry is often very decontextualized, so it can tell us very little about ownership. Legal sources, as you can see here, frequently talk about who owned jewelry, but they also give the impression of how difficult it was to establish who owned jewels. So in this case, obviously, the woman thought she had received jewels as part of a bequest, but then she didn't. Now, all of this is significant in itself because it shows how immensely contested the objects these were. Now, in the early empire, we often find disputes around women's jewelry covered by private arbitration, and the digest, of which you here have a piece, a collection of Roman jurist commentary, often mentions contested wills and the like, often because testators had been imprecise in their terminology when describing jewelry in their wills, as here. In the later empire, the emperor sometimes regulated the transmission of jewelry, and ownership of jewelry became an even hotter topic because of Christian discourses about the renunciation of property, which often revolved around wealthy women. And because I'm a historian of late antiquity, it is on one such case I want to concentrate today. In 390, Emperors Valentinian II and Theodosius I issued a law about Christian deaconesses. As you see here. This was a specific ecclesiastical office for widows with some liturgical duties. The widows in question were often of the high elite. We know this from other sources, and this law also clearly envisages wealthy women taking up the office. The law specified that when a deaconess entered her office, her property, bona, should be entrusted to suitable people to be managed with due diligence, presumably because she took a vow of poverty. But the law goes on to distinguish between different types of property and different kinds of control over them. The widowed deaconess maintained full power, potestas integra, over her landed wealth, her praedia, which she could sell or give or bequeath as she wished. But the law continued, she shall squander none of her necklaces, monilia and superlectilis, I come back to that, what that is, none of her gold and silver and other signs of a noble home under the pretense of religion, but she shall transfer in writing everything intact to her children or relatives or any others according to the judgment of her free will, and when she dies, she shall designate as heirs no church, no cleric or poor person. The law goes on to make further swipes at clerics who extort goods from the deaconess by letter, gift, codicil, or testament. This law has often been looked at when discussing the emergence of Christian institutions and clerics as influential social actors, especially through their cultivation of wealthy women. The role of jewelry within this has, however, not been particularly highlighted, except predictably by Peter Brown. I think mainly based on this law, although he does not say so, he intervenes, perhaps unconsciously, in the debate about what Roman women's property consisted in. Now, he claims it was mostly in jewelry because of the restrictions on women's ability to dispose of property. He thinks that because their wealth was so mobile, there was a worry that women may become the target of clerical legacy hunters. Our law could reflect that late Roman women's property was mostly in jewelry. According to Roman law, legacies could not exceed more than three quarters of someone's whole estate. So if a woman had mostly jewelry and gave most of it away, she could have been in breach of this. But although I think women probably owned more jewelry than men did, I'm not sure that is what's going on here, mainly because this principle was very well established and did not need to be legislated on again. What I do think is that there was a desire to keep jewels in aristocratic hands and in circulation between aristocratic families. This was not only because of jewels' sentimental or economic value, but because they were increasingly seen as emblems of rank, a particular late antique development. For this reason, our law was even astonishingly willing to override women's ownership rights. Before we get to these arguments, let us first deal with the context of this law. As it was later inserted into the Theodosian Code, it is abridged and therefore difficult to understand what exactly it is reacting to. There have been attempts to connect it with particular clerics like Jerome or Pelagius, who around the same time advised female aristocrats in Rome about the right Christian lifestyle. This is, however, tricky. The law was directed at the Praetorian prefect of the East. It prohibited donations of jewels to churches and not just freewheeling clerics, and the office of the deaconess was not known in the West. Nonetheless, it wouldn't be surprising if Christian Roman women, perhaps more than classical Roman women, thought that giving away their jewelry would be the right thing to do. As is well known, patristic literature is full of what Ria Berg has called the rhetoric of unadornment, which paints jewelry as a danger to modesty and chastity. And this is quite similar to discourses around the deficiency of female beautification that we find in classical literature, although with more attention to the transient worldly nature of makeup and jewelry. At the same time, there was also an emerging Christian discourse around the symbolic meaning of jewels, especially of pearls, whose rarity and perfection made them suitable metaphors to think about faith, salvation, and the nature of Christ. Such thinking was, of course, behind the decoration of churches with precious objects to adorn the house of God rather than the human female body. It should be noted, however, that among clerics, there was anxiety about appearing as furthering what our law criticizes, that clerics courted women to get their hands on jewels. Such anxieties are echoed quite a lot in late Roman literature. And as an example, I want to give a perhaps less well-known text, but to my mind, intriguing case, that of St. Patrick in his Confessions. Patrick's confession is now commonly dated to the 5th century and believed to have been written as a sort of defense against critique of his conduct in Ireland from ecclesiastical authorities in Britain. I am no expert on this, but I think the source shows quite well not only lay critique of giving jewels to the church, but also the uneasiness of church authorities upon receiving them. Surely this was often welcomed, but they were also considered deeply problematic, not only for fear of being accused of corruption, but also because these were objects that had touched female bodies. So kind of throwing them onto the altar was a bit, well, not really on. Of course, protestations of never having received or accepted anything should not be proof that this didn't happen. Quite the contrary. It is worth noting, however, that even those who the law paints as beneficiaries were not entirely convinced if the benefaction was a direct and public handing over of jewels. I would actually argue that our law was less concerned with donations to clerics or churches per se than with what was donated, singling out jewelry as particularly contentious. The law is, in fact, trying to create definable units within widows' property with a view to legislating on how each of these could be transmitted, land on the one hand and precious objects on the other. Now, it is true that there were or could be definable units within a widow's patrimony that had special conditions of transmission attached to them, and increasingly so in late antiquity. So things she did not own. These were things that came with her dowry. If it had come to her after her husband's death, she kind of could use these things, but she didn't own them. I'll come back to that. And also the so-called donations before marriage. Late Roman emperors frequently were legislated on these bits of property, and especially on the donations before marriage. These were from groom to bride and became a significant transaction between families from the 3rd century on, to the extent of matching the dowry, which went from the bride's family to the husband. By the end of the 4th century, they were kind of equal in size, or sometimes the donations were even more. This legislation mostly concerned remarriage of widows, and it obliged women to keep any dotal possessions intact for their children. They could use them, but had to keep them intact until their death. Our law seamlessly inserts itself into these concerns about what Anti-Achava has called property masses thought to form a common family fund which had to be preserved for descendants. Now, the dowry and the donations before marriage probably frequently contained jewels, although they could also contain land, slaves, and other items. But these were not the only sources by which widows could acquire jewelry and which established ownership. It is possible that a widow had bought their own jewelry, although we have little information about this. She could, of course, have acquired jewelry through gifts, for example, from clients, so inheritance and bequests, especially from female relatives. Now, Roman jurists notably often discuss female-female transmission of jewry through legacies or fideicommissa, so instructions to an heir to keep certain bits of jewry for certain women and to pass them on eventually. We also find jewelry mentioned among parapherna, items of personal use that a bride brought with her, but was outside her dowry, and among actual wedding gifts. Finally, although gifts between spouses continued to be prohibited, it was customary for husbands to leave as legacies to their wives things they had bought for their use, which very frequently contained jewels, as shown by a standard testamentary clause that Roman jurists often cited. I've given you an example here. So it is very likely that in their jewelry boxes, late Roman widows had objects that were dotal possessions, which she was meant to keep for her children, and objects that she owned outright, and in theory could do with what she wanted as long as it didn't exceed the share of heirs and so on. The bequests from husbands were a tricky subject, as he used funds that would otherwise have gone to his heirs to furnish the looks of his wife. But still, if a widow received such a legacy, she owned them. She owned these jewels. Our law, however, apparently groups all of this together. The pairing of necklaces and gold and silver with superlectilis, literally bedding, but probably luxury fabrics, presents all objects of this type as a kind of trousseau. Why? Now, it is of course true that it may have been very difficult for widows to keep track of the different provenances of her jewels, or as a matter of fact, her linen. These were objects that were presumably held together for frequent use despite different provenances. And this is, of course, also the case for Meghan Markle's earrings, which kind of are apparently with kind of crown property. Since some of them were supposed to go to descendants, some of these jewels that a widow had in her box, as dotal possessions, from the perspective of the law, it would have been considered safer to treat them all together so that this would actually happen. But this confirms that there was a special meaning attached to widow's jewels that went beyond herself and encompassed her wider family and even aristocratic society altogether. Of course, jewels could have sentimental values, especially if they were usually passed on to the female line and to kind of daughters and female relatives. It is unlikely our law would have got involved in this, though. They also clearly had economic values, perhaps heightened by the fact that by late antiquity, when jewels were not acquired anymore through spoils of war, or not very much, there must have also have been a decreasing pool in circulation. To bring jewels into the Roman Empire was a very expensive thing to do. As mobile objects, jewels could be turned into ready cash, for example, to fulfill duties related to aristocratic offices, such as games giving, very expensive in late antiquity. And they were also used as security to get loans. We do know this from other laws. Jewels also had social values. As mobile objects, they did indeed make perfect gifts. And such gifts were needed to lubricate the social networks that held the elite together. For example, when shortly after our law was issued, the ascetic Melania went to see the Empress Serena, and she took jewels with her as gifts to sweeten her entrance. Donating such objects to the church would take them out of such circulation between lay elites. And perhaps there was an element of competition with emerging clerical establishments to prevent clerics to have the upper hand when it came to enhancing social ties. I was intrigued to learn from Dr. McCarran that Roman bishops apparently kept a stock of suitable gifts to women. In the early 7th century, Pope Boniface sent Ethelberg, the Queen of Northumbria, a silver mirror and an ivory comb. Now, these, I think, may have been objects that women had at one time had donated to the Roman Church, which were then clearly not sold or turned into ecclesiastical decorations because not suitable, but stowed away for further use of a more secular type, if you will. But our law also uses some interesting language to group the widow's jewels, fabrics, gold, and silver together. That gives us further insight into what such objects stood for, at least at this time. It calls them insignia of a noble house. Clarus, so the adjective used, must be a reference to senatorial rank. This sounds like more than female attire being a display of wealth or conspicuous consumption. It hints at these objects as being official emblems of rank, something that only women of senatorial rank were allowed to wear, and which therefore had to be kept in this group. In earlier Latin literature, we find some reference to pieces of jewelry being senatorial women's insignia. For example, Tacitus uses the term insignia for the anatus of a senator's daughter. There was, however, no earlier legislation that assigned certain pieces of jewelry or the wearing of jewelry at all to particular types of women, beyond the wearing of golden rings, which up to the 3rd century was reserved for people of senatorial rank. In late antiquity, the encoding of a hierarchical order through attire was even more prominent, and now there was much more legislation on who could wear what. Actresses, for example, were not allowed to wear gold and jewels, and some jewels, pearls, emeralds, and jacinths, were reserved for the emperor only. But this law, which specifies this or reminds people of this, actually excludes elite women from this provision, suggesting that female adornment was considered an important way to project status and surely not just their own. And astonishingly, by this reckoning, the emperor and senatorial women shared the same attire. At the same time, male imperial officials certainly had insignia, such as the belt, the chlamys, and the crossbow brooch. We know little about whether such male ceremonial dress was matched by their wives, but some iconography suggests it was. Consider, for example, the famous Projector casket, also from circa 380, so around our Law's time, from Rome, where the lid shows a senatorial couple. He's distinguished by the crossbow brooch and chlamys, and she wears a necklace of the collar type, which double and triple rows. It is a rather ceremonial representation of this couple on an object, the casket, which is maybe a jewel box, meant to be used in a women's bedroom. And is of course rather similar, including in terms of women's jewelry, to this equally famous and very public object, the so-called Monza diptych. But we find collar necklaces like this one on many representations of late Roman elite women, including the mosaic from the Villa de Casale, that is my backdrop. An interesting development because before the 3rd century, senatorial women were rarely portrayed bejeweled. We can see, therefore, both that late Roman families may have put pressure on the emperor to issue a law that kept widows' jewels in the hands of families, or at least aristocrats, but also the emperor's willingness, very interested in social order, of course, to give into this pressure, despite their own Christian commitments. However, only 2 months after the law was issued, it was retracted. Now, why? It is, of course, possible that wealthy widows had objected. They may have done so because they wanted to turn over property to the church. But more importantly, they may have done so because the law was a quite unprecedented interference into their private property. Until now, no one could have stopped them bequeathing jewels, their own, to whoever they wished, as long as they didn't exceed the share of heirs and so on. It is, however, likely that such interference also worried many senatorial men, however much they thought about their women's jewels as their own emblems of status. And in the end, private property won the day, at least at the level of the law. I don't know how much time I have left, but I wanted to end with 2 texts that have also often been looked at, although yet again, without attention to what they tell us about jewelry. One is the eulogy that Jerome, a famous ascetic and cleric, wrote about his friend Macella, a Roman aristocratic widow who had allegedly been the first to embrace asceticism in Rome. She died shortly after the sack of Rome, 410, and this letter dates to 412. Here, Jerome describes how, when she set out as an ascetic decades ago, so when she was young, Macella chose to override her rights of ownership to her monilia and her superlectilis, to transfer all of this to her male cousins to humor her mother. This made her lose money, which she could have used for the poor. Jerome clearly echoes our law, intriguingly describing Macella as exactly doing what it prescribes before it had even been issued, and he writes after it has been retracted. It is not certain whether any of this happened. I think Jerome is having great fun. He has a game with the legal timeline, and it gives him great pleasure to turn Macella's relatives into squanderers and legacy hunters, and exactly the kind of people the law denigrates, which was entirely right, because Macella owned these jewels she was handing over. So she would have been free to do with them what she wanted. The other text is from the so-called Book of Pontiffs on the foundation of a church in Rome in the early 5th century. It was founded by order of an illustrious Lady Vestina in her will, so she was clearly the wife or probably the widow of a high-ranking senator. It's famous because of the long list of urban and rural properties that the church was endowed with, and because it is one of the few aristocratic church foundations that we know of in Rome. What has so far rarely been commented on is that Vestina ordered in her will to raise the money of the church itself, the building, through the sale of her jewels. Here was therefore a widow who was completely at ease to do with her jewels what she wanted, as she could have, since there was no law against it anymore. This is after the law was retracted, so she could be the good Christian she wanted to be. But it's also notable that Vestina was also a good aristocrat. She did in fact not directly donate her jewels to the church, but she ordered to sell them. And as such, assuming that the most likely buyers would be other aristocrats, hoped to keep them in aristocratic circulation. And here, by the way, is her church. San Vitale on the Via Nazionale in Rome, preserved mostly in its original state. And next time you go to Rome, do visit if you haven't, or go visit again. And remember, what you see now used to be a Roman woman's jewels. But if our law had not been retracted, it may well not be there. Thank you.
Tim, if I could just pitch in quickly here. Could I urge participants, and there are more than 100 of you, to please put questions for our speakers, if you wish, in the Q&A box. So I have some already for Zosia, but do please not hesitate to offer up some questions for Julia, and well, we're going to come on now to Pim. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Julia, for a really fascinating glimpse into an area of domestic life that most of us, I think, never really thought of. And it is extremely interesting. And if you go back into Roman history, actually, the number of times that women are almost defined by their jewelry, you know, when they want to contribute something to the good of the state, you know, they sell their jewelry or donate it to the treasury, you know, as when the Gauls famously attacked the city of Rome back in the 4th century BC, or I think under Marcus Aurelius at the time of the Marcomannic Wars. I think women sort of flocked to the palace to give up their jewelry. Fascinating. Okay, well, our next speaker is Professor Penelope Allison, Pim Allison, who I understand is speaking from Australia. Is that right, Pim? Yeah. Goodness knows what time of day it must be there anyway. But Pim is at the University of Leicester and is a Roman archaeologist who deals with various aspects of Roman metropolitan and provincial archaeology. Also, I understand, deals with Australian archaeology and early colonial settlement, which is absolutely fascinating. I didn't know that until I looked Pim up on the internet. But what she's best known for among Roman historians, of course, is her work on houses and households in Pompeii, and particularly on the material contents, the household interiors, the decorations and furnishings. And today she's got the fascinating title, Artificial Intelligence and the Roman Table. So, Pim, please, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. I'm struggling a bit with my internet, so I may have to turn my video off. And I'm just going to now try and share my screen with you. Can you see it?
Yes, we can. That's or I can anyway.
Oh, hang on, that's gone too far. Let me just go back again. Okay, so have you got the full screen there, have you? Okay, yes, as I say, my internet's not working very well this morning, so I hope it's going to hold up. If it doesn't, I'll then turn my video off. So I'm going to talk about artificial intelligence in the Roman table. And what I'm looking at is the development of new approaches to Roman tablewares. I'll be talking about a research network that we ran between 2015-16 called Big Data on the Roman Table, or BDRT for short. And this network was looking at how Roman pottery can be more effectively used to better understand eating and drinking practices across the Roman world. And this led to a research project which has been running since 2019 and will continue to 2023 called ArchiScan. And the aim of this project is to see how we can use automated recording and machine learning techniques to record Roman ceramic tablewares more comprehensively. Now, ceramic tablewares are some of the most extensive archaeological remains in the Roman world, and they're important evidence for investigating the socio-cultural practices of eating and drinking. However, we have major barriers to using this wealth of artifacts to understanding questions about consumption practices. And these barriers are, in fact, the very extensiveness of this truly big archaeological data. It's a very time-consuming and also very costly specialist process to actually classify this material. So it's often only classified, catalogued and classified selectively and summarily, and I'll talk about reasons for this shortly. And because it's only selectively recorded, the kinds of data sets that we have are not very useful for doing sort of more consumption-oriented analyses. For example, for looking at the way people eat and drink within sites, between different buildings and sites, for example, different houses, and also among sites. So Big Data on the Roman Table Network was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and the stated aim was to explore and to develop interdisciplinary quantitative and qualitative approaches to material cultural evidence for social relations around food and drink in the Roman world. Together with Martin Pitts, we were the chief investigators of this network, and there were 50 participants in the network. These were professional and university archaeologists, museum curators, and also digital humanities experts, mathematicians and computer scientists. And they came from the UK, from Europe, from Egypt, and from North America. We had two main activities. We had two workshops, two two-day workshops were held as part of this network, and the results of some of the papers have been selected for publication in Internet Archaeology, Volume 50. Now, one of the reasons for running this network was that most of the people who took part in it felt that the approaches to Roman ceramic tablewares for the investigation of Roman foodways have been rather limited to date. And there are several reasons for this. One is the poor, and I'll go through each of these, but I'll just point them out now. The poor quality of the data, the lack of, and I put in brackets, pertinent scholarly vision. I'm not saying people have not had scholarly vision, but vision in relation to the sorts of questions that the people at this network were trying to answer. And the third one was the limitations of our analytical and visualization techniques, and the fourth is a lack of comprehensive and consistent recording within and across data sets. Now, when I say poor data quality, one of the things that Roman archaeologists have to deal with particularly is what we might call legacy data. This is a computer science term, but it refers to either data that have not been digitized, and a lot of us have to work with previous excavation reports. These might be published reports, or they might be grey literature, notebooks, sometimes handwritten notebooks, and also descriptions by ancient authors. Ancient authors wrote about various kinds of tablewares, and many scholars have tried to relate the terminology that we get from the ancient texts to the artifacts that are found in archaeological contexts. But it also relates to data that's digitized in obsolete systems, for example, artifacts, catalogs that have been formatted and made in formats that are no longer used. I'll talk about that in a minute. And also the collection and characterization of the data, the kind of categories that it's been classified by, are not necessarily suitable for the types of analyses that we want to do to better understand the way pottery was used, the way eating and drinking vessels were actually used. And I'm showing as an example here my work on Pompeii, which Tim mentioned. At the top, we have the excavation report from the House of the Menander, written in 1932. handwritten, beautifully handwritten, I might say. And then at the bottom, we have my conversion of that material. First of all, I did this work in the 1980s. So I converted it to DBase, which was a very clunky kind of database in those days, because you could only have so many characters per cell. So you were limited in the numbers of how you could actually describe an object. So I was not only limited by the using of the notebooks, if you like, the excavations, the giornali degli scavi, but also by what we might now call an outmoded format. And I'll come on to talk about that a bit shortly. Anyway, I was able to produce a book out of it. But again, the data is not the best quality, not sort of quality of data that we might expect by today's standards. But the other reason I say that our resources are limited is a lack of pertinent scholarly vision. Now, this doesn't mean, as I say, that people haven't been visionary, but the pottery studies to date have really focused on two aspects. The first one is the investigation of pottery manufacture and production. People have spent a lot of time looking at the kind of fabrics, trying to trace the origins of the fabrics, trying to trace the techniques that have been used, not only to understand the pottery, but also to develop typologies of the pottery that are very useful for dating sites. So I'm showing you the Terrace Gelata, which we'll be talking about a lot in this talk today. Well, it's evening there, this morning for me. And I'm showing you some pictures of some of the pottery from Pompeii, where you can see in the center a drawing of what's Aretine sigillata with a stamp seal from the bottom of the vessel identifying the maker. So a lot of the Pompeian material has been collected really because it had these stamps on them rather than particular interest in Roman pottery. The other main focus for investigations of Roman pottery studies have been on economics and trade. This has been the trade of the contents, as we see on the right from the Bodrum Museum in southwest Turkey, a whole lot of amphorae that have been found in shipwrecks off the southwest coast of Turkey. And these amphorae were being traded not for the amphorae themselves, but for the contents. And obviously we can study the fabric, we can find out where these vessels have come from, and therefore understand the kind of trade patterns that were happening around the Roman world. And then the pottery can be traded for the pottery itself, as we see below, Samian pottery from South Gaul that was turning up at Vindolanda, and we can see the kinds of pottery that they were importing into this area in the sort of far reaches of the Roman Empire. So the third limitation I said was the limitations of analytical and visual techniques, which is kind of coupled with this limitation of the kind of legacy data that we have to deal with. And I'm showing you here, I hope you can see this, a histogram which shows you the distribution of the different forms of terra sigillata, of Italian terra sigillata, throughout the various establishments in the insula of the Menander and Pompeii. So for example, but we have on the right house 110-4, which is actually the house of the Menander. And then going across to the left, from right to left here, we go from the largest to the smallest building or smallest dwelling in the insula of the Menander. So 110-9 is the smallest. And if you look at the key down the right-hand side, which sort of equates more or less to the photographs I've included here, we have the blue and small cups, and then up to glass and bowls. These are percentages, not numbers here. And then going down to the smallest house, which seems to only have bowls. Obviously, there weren't many vessels found in the smaller houses. So I'm not trying to sort of interpret this too much here, but it's interesting to see this pattern that people are using different kinds of vessels in different kinds of establishments. So they're eating differently. Now we might say that this is because the grander houses are having sort of more elite dinner parties and formal dinners. But it's interesting that they have more cups and bowls and very few plates, which is kind of the opposite to what we see in later periods. For example, we think of the bowls, the broth bowls of the Middle Ages and the lower, the sort of more common use, and the plates being a more sort of elite use coming into the 17th century. Whether this pattern is true outside the insula of the Menander has yet to be investigated, but it's a way of looking at these vessels and a way of thinking about how people in different contexts might have eaten their food. Another aspect of the big data in the Roman table was that we discussed a lot about these cups, these small cups, and Geoffrey Daniel, who's an expert on Samian, has argued that these were not wine cups at all, but they were rather sauce bowls. The word acetabulum is the word used in the text, so a small vinegar bowl, for example, and he argues that these were used for dipping bread, and so there were bowls. So what we possibly have is the kind of eating practices from those in the smaller establishments where they perhaps had a kind of tapas, perhaps, where you passed around small bowls of sauces and dipped your bread into them. I'm projecting here, but this is the sort of questions. These are the sorts of questions that we were trying to look at ways of answering through the big data in the Roman table network. Here's another example of where we're trying patterns across a site. This is one of the military sites that I looked at in my study of people and spaces and Roman military bases. The fort of Ellingen in southern Germany, where we have on the left, this is really work by Martin Sterry. He came to me one day and showed me his fantastic color spectrum. And I thought this is a great way to visualize patterns of distribution of artifacts. So on the left, we have a correspondence analysis where at the very bottom, I don't know how clearly you can see this, the little red crosses are Samian South Gaulish sigillata. The little blue diamonds are other types of sigillata. The green stars are German sigillata, so they're kind of more local sigillata. And then the purple dots are handmaids and more utilitarian vessels. Now, if we plot that, if we take that correspondence analysis and put it onto the color spectrum, we'll see that the Samian wares are in the sort of bluey zone, and the handmade wares are in the kind of reddy, orangey sort of zone. And if we go to look at the buildings in the Insula of Menander, the buildings at the bottom left, sorry, not Insula of Menander, we're on the fort of Ellingen at the moment. The buildings at the bottom are thought to be the commander's officer's houses from the second phase. There may have been an earlier commanding officer's house here, and that's where we find most of the Gaulish, the South Gaulish terra sigillata, whereas the more common sort of handmade wares are found in these little smaller barrack buildings up here. So it might show you that the people within this fort, that the higher ranking officers are using the more important pottery, and the local soldiers, the auxiliary soldiers, this was an auxiliary fort, are using the handmade pottery. The very large barrack building on the right, building in block B, takes up nearly 50% of the whole site, so it's sort of plotting to the middle, so it's got a mixture of everything. So again, I'm not trying to interpret this too much, but this is sorts of ways that we can think about how we can look across these assemblages. Again, this is legacy data, so they're not totally comprehensive, but it was more recently excavated, so I think these pottery assemblages are more secure than the Menander ones. But again, showing you a way of thinking about looking at people's different consumption, eating and drinking practices within a site. And then Martin Sterry has taken this further by using Stephen Willis's study in the Internet Archaeology series on the distribution of Samian around Britain. And here he shows the distribution of forms. So he's done the same sort of thing, the same kind of correspondence analysis as he did for Ellingen, with this record of Samian across Britain. And he's looked at 3 different phases. I don't know exactly what all the colors, so I'm really just demonstrating this technique. Where we get a change in the kinds of forms that were used in the first phase, in the first century, then in the second phase, in late first to mid second century, we have quite a different pattern, and then a different pattern again in the third phase. I can, for example, tell you that this sort of orangey color are these decorated bowls like Dragendorf 29 that I'm showing you here. So we have a lot of these occurring, or we get a concentration of these around Hadrian's Wall, and also in Colchester. And then this concentration continues to a certain extent in the western area of Hadrian's Wall, but quite a different pattern changing from the earlier phase to the kinds of vessels that people were using. Presumably the earlier phase has more local vessels, more beakers and things like that, as we move to the later period with more imported vessels. Okay, so the fourth limitation is the lack of comprehensive and consistent recording across data sets. Now, as I said, Roman tablewares are really truly archaeological big data. We have millions, literally millions of Roman tableware remains found across the Roman world. But how do we actually deal with all this material? How do we compile it so that we can analyze it? I've shown you, as I say, an example from Britain. How can we compare practices between different sites and different regions of the Roman world? And how can we achieve consistent and comprehensive recording rather than selective recording, as we're doing in most cases today? And how can we do this efficiently and reliably? So how can we compile a Roman pottery data across different data sets? Now, the big data in the Roman table network included computer scientists who were specialists in data collection systems for asking questions across diverse data sets. And I'm showing you Emilio Trosto demonstrating what we call an ontological database, or called ontologies, not the philosophical ontologies, but computer science ontology. Now, most of us use spreadsheets and relational databases, and what he's arguing here is that we ought to be using ontological databases. And to sort of simplify this, I think you need to think about the semantic web, because it's actually ontological databases that underlie the current semantic web. So if you ask Google, well, you couldn't even ask Google a question 20 years ago. If you asked Google a question 10 years ago, it would be a very clunky kind of question, and often you wouldn't come up with the right answer. Now you can sort of give a whole sentence. You can say, why is my computer playing up today? And you'll get all sorts of answers back from Google. So that's the kind of thing, the kind of, if you like, a phrase. This is now a database that is not just a series of cells, but it's a number of linked cells that link in different ways. And what we have here at the bottom is the spreadsheet of the Younglingan tablewares, and on the left we have an ontological, sort of a kind of prototype ontological database, which my postdoctoral fellow Dan van Helden developed using the Younglingan material, so that if you want to add another site in which has different categories, you can just add that site in. You don't have to recreate the database as you would have to with Access or some other relational database. Ontological database can be built on infinitely and has a much more flexible structure. I'm not an expert on this, but it's a way that you can actually link two different sites together. Even if the cells are different, you can say this cell equals this cell, or you can add another cell, another column, if you like, in terms of a spreadsheet, to develop a much more comprehensive database that can include all the categories from different site types. So how do we achieve consistent and comprehensive recording rather than selective recording? Now, this was not really one of the initial foci of the big data from the Roman table, but we realized that for taking more consumption-oriented approaches to these millions of tablewares, we needed a more systematic and comprehensive and more holistic recording process. It's not just appropriate to just record the diagnostic vessels. When you're looking at things like trade patterns or manufacturing patterns, you really just need diagnostic sherds. But if you want to look at consumption patterns, you need to understand, like I showed you briefly with these, the inch of the Menander and also these other plots that Martin Sterry did, you need to have a much more comprehensive cataloguing process to make these more rigorous. So how can we democratize what is currently very specialist and also quite costly process of classifying and cataloguing Roman pottery? Can we make this process more inclusive? Might this process be improved through automation? Can we get more comprehensive and consistent compilation of data sets, more objectivity in our cataloguing process, and can we then create large inter-site data sets that are suitable for the analysis of pottery that we can then use in these kind of ontological databases? Now, one of the useful things for this project, I'm sort of moving from big data in the Roman table through to the archive scan project, is that these millions of tablewares are fairly consistent in their sort of overall fabric type, and they're fairly consistent in their range of forms throughout the Roman world. And I'm showing you, for example, the Samian bowls from La Grafisink in southern Gaul, and a terra sigillata bowl from Asia Minor. So they're mostly bowls and plates. They're open vessels. They're mostly this ubiquitous redware that we're all very familiar with from across the Roman world, this sort of highly glazed ware. So there is some sort of similarity, which makes the idea of automation much easier, or sort of limited, should I say, limited number of forms. So we had mathematicians who were taking part in the BDRT network as well. These were specialists in artificial intelligence, image recognition, and machine learning techniques. And so they were looking at how we can use these techniques to record Roman tablewares more comprehensively. If we were able to automate the process, could we record more pottery? I show you a graph at the bottom, which shows you the percentage error of artificial intelligence object detection. Back in 2010, this only goes up to 2016 because this comes out of the Big Data in the Roman Table Network publication on this particular aspect of the network. So in 2010, the error was 28.2%, and by 2016, yes, it was 2.9%. So it was less than the human eye, considerably less than the human eye, and that's 5 years ago. So it may be. It is even better today. Of course, one can say, well, whose human eye? The human eye of a student looking at pottery is not nearly as skilled as the human eye of a pottery specialist. So the human eye itself even varies. But basically, artificial intelligence has become much more sophisticated and much more able to recognize, used particularly in medical practice and stuff, to recognize diseases and things that are often better than a specialist can. So we decided to develop a prototype. Professor Ivan Tukin from the School of Mathematics and Actuary Sciences at Leicester developed some artificial intelligence algorithms that were similar to facial recognition software to develop a prototype for recording Roman pottery. So in November 2016, we scanned vessels in the Jury War Museum in Leicester to test this prototype. And here you can see Ivan and Konstantin Savaikov recording Roman pottery in the Jury Wall Museum, and they're using a normal smartphone. So our aim was to try, as I say, to kind of democratize the recording process and to use handheld mobile devices as scanners to record the vessel forms. And here's the results. Again, I'm not an expert on artificial intelligence, but these results were that the vessel, the machine, the algorithm or the software in the mobile phone could immediately recognize this vessel here in a different context at a different scale. Again, here it could recognize these vessels instantaneously. So Ivan and I applied again for a large research grant, and we got some funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council in 2019 for a project called ArchiScan, Automated Machine Learning Techniques for Recording and Collating Roman Tablewares. We have 3 mathematicians as co-investigators on this project, 2 postdoctoral fellows, Dan Van Helden and Santos Nunez Hirano, and then my PhD student, Victoria Safara, is the research assistant. And our partners are Museum of London Archaeology, Vindolanda Trust, and the Colchester and Ipswich Museums, who are all providing the data, or all providing the material that we're using to train this artificial intelligence system. So we commenced our work in November 2019, and we focused on Samian ware because of its limited form and fabric variation. And we were trying, basically what we need to do is train the program on literally thousands of Samian sherds from the collections of our partner organizations. So we have involved non-experts, some of the team are non-experts, but we've also involved students and volunteers. We need a lot of vessels to train the device. Machine learning requires, means that the artifact can see, the more artifacts the machine can see, the more it learns and the more efficient it becomes. So in 2019, in December 2019, we did our first kind of field work in the Museum of London storerooms, where we scanned complete or near complete tableware vessels. the mathematicians were a bit surprised at what we called a complete vessel. I think they thought they were all going to be beautiful whole vessels like a modern vessel, so they're a bit shocked to see that they weren't really all complete. So Dan and Santos developed a system to try and take systematic images of each vessel, and you can see there kind of diagram on the left. Excuse me, taking photographs from top, bottom, and then rotating the vessel and taking 3 shots from the sides of the vessel. So that was working with whole pots, and then in at the beginning of 2020, we started to look at how we would record sherds. And here's Santos explaining to me how to record a sherd. And basically, it was placed, if you imagine the sherd in a small box and you show both sides and then rotate it around. So you end up with 4 profiles and 2 inside and outside images. So 6 images per vessel. And we have here the mobile phone now is mounted on a mount, so it's fairly stable, and that we have there a 2-dimensional scale. So the vessel is photographed in that little square next to that scale. The ones that we did in the Museum of London, we had a 3-dimensional scale. I didn't point that out in that last slide, sorry. So here we are doing this work in the Museum of London Archaeological Service. We worked for about 3 weeks between January and March 2020. On the left, you see Dan and Santos using these mobile phones, scanning pottery, mobile phones mounted on these mounts. In the center, you see my PhD student, Alexander Piguri, who is a specialist on commonwares from late antique Rome, and Evgeny Merkos, who's one of the mathematicians co-investigators on the project. And on the right is a student volunteer from Birkbeck. You might note the very fetching bright green gloves. These are so that the machine doesn't confuse the flesh of your hand with the pottery. I know of no Roman pottery that's bright green, so we're quite safe using this color. So that's why everyone's wearing those gloves. And here you can see another student with his gloves on, taking a photograph, and you can see how we're trying to keep our fingers out of the picture as much as possible and take a photograph, take these 6 images of the vessel. Excuse me. But also I mentioned, well, I didn't mention, but on the top of the mobile phone is a little magnifying glass, and this will take a photo of the fabric itself. So we're not just recording the shapes, but we're also recording the fabrics. And so here we are all working happily. Fiona Seeley from Molar is explaining the site that we're working on, the pottery, to the students. Santos is explaining the artificial intelligence system to them. Sarah Colley, my colleague here in the middle, was videoing our work. So we had lots of people very active, and a very happy volunteer here showing how much pottery he's just scanned. So this is what we were doing in the middle of March last year, and then suddenly we were hit by the COVID pandemic, which meant that we couldn't work in these conditions anymore. We couldn't have all these people working around. In fact, we had to abandon in the middle of our work the work that we were doing at Molar. So really from March and through to January, our project in terms of this sort of scanning millions of vessels was put on hold. So in the meantime, Santos and Dan worked on how we might develop other ways of developing this AI system. If we couldn't record lots and lots of pots, what we were going to do. So what Santos Nunes Tirano did was he took profile drawings, or he and Dan both worked together, from Webster and Dannell's Roman Samian pottery in Britain, and created artificial pots by rotating their profiles around their central axis to create a 3D image. So on the left, we have a digitized version of the drawings from this book, and on the right, we have this 3D simulated vessel. So we're able to create lots of vessels without actually going and photographing them. And here is the kind of interim result. What this did is they could pre-train the neural networks of the machine learning process. So this meant that they could make the vessel more sensitive to the particularities of the various forms in the data set. They could use fewer forms, but train it on a lot of simulated forms. We started, so far we've done this with the whole vessels from the Museum of London. And here's some examples. We used 3 different procedures to develop simulated types of vessels, and then tested the accuracy of these three different, and one of them, I can't remember which one came up as the more accurate one. This is work we've only just finished. We're only in the process of publishing it at the moment. So we were able to use fairly low numbers and would normally be used in image recognition, and we got a certain amount of success. The machine learning technique was the service was able to recognize the more common forms of pterosagillae, of Samian. So at the moment, we're now looking at developing this process for more fragmentary pottery, and we are getting, yeah, I think it's going to work. I hope it's going to work, because otherwise I don't know what we're going to do. So basically, in terms of domesticity and domestic life, artificial intelligence and Roman pottery is leading to more comprehensive recording processes of Roman tablewares, which will lead us to better understandings of eating and drinking practices across the Roman world, which will lead to better understandings of socio-cultural differences in domestic practice across the Roman world. I need to point out here that we tend to think, oh, it's all just Roman pottery, it's all the same stuff, they all lay around on triclinia and their togas and use these vessels, but we don't really know how these vessels were used, and I think my histogram from the Insula of Menandus shows that. And this is something that we can start to look at how people, obviously the Rome world's a huge world, and people had different approaches to food and drink, and they may have used the same vessels, but they may have used them in different combinations, and that's why we need a more comprehensive and more holistic approach to our recording, so that we can see how different assemblage, how the assemblages might be different in different parts of the Roman world. And I just want to end here with an image created by Jesus Pajamo Torrado from the Big Data of the Roman Table Network, where he's showing a mother telling off her daughter because she hasn't set the table right, because she hasn't read the typologies of Roman pottery that we Roman pottery specialists tend to rely on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pim, and indeed thank everybody who has been both speaking, and we still have over 70 participants. So I'm going to take questions in order. We've got just a few minutes left for questions. If I could ask, and everybody has done, the panelists to video themselves again and unmute themselves, that's great. So let me start with you, Zosia, a relatively gentle one from Richard New. And your talk was largely about the physicality of the site, Olynthos, that you were specifically looking at, rather than the theoretical or intellectual dimensions of the topic. And his question is, can you advise, please, what the overall status of the preservation of mud brick construction is, compared, for example, to that of the preservation of stone construction?
Well, yes, I think there is another earlier question, Paul, but we can come back to that.
Yes, so I'd started you off with a little gentle log.
All right.
We're going to get really tough.
Yes.
The next one, and then mine is an
mud brick.
killer.
Well, mud brick. You know, having looked at an awful lot of mud every day for the past year, I feel I really know mud. I have made friends with it. But at Olynthos, the mud brick, we have found fragmentary mud brick in many trenches during the Olynthos project. I showed a small image of a drawing from the Robinson publications, which shows surviving mud brick on one wall. And that's really intended to show that the Robinson team did indeed find mud bricks, and there is some evidence about the dimensions. And this is really the basis for the current work that my colleague Matthew Fitzjohn has done to estimate the sizes. In order to estimate the quantity needed, you've got to know what the average size of a brick is. So there are two sizes that Robinson's team identified. And we have fragments of mud brick from a number of trenches from the past 6 years. So we've got some material to compare with the legacy data from the Johns Hopkins project. And this is at least goes some way towards understanding what the relationship is between what we can do using contemporary techniques and what was done in the 1920s and 30s. There is a Newcastle PhD student, Mara Schumacher, who may be among us, I'm not sure, who is working on the mud brick from Olynthos. So she has taken samples of mud brick from a range of trenches, and she gave a presentation at the AIA-SCS in January on her preliminary findings. So we are going to be able to use that data in the final publications for identifying different types of mud brick. And obviously what's interesting here is, well, what are they made with? Are they, what are the aggregates that you get in these bricks? In terms of survival, obviously the surviving stone is much better represented, but of course stone can be taken away, and in many cases it is indeed taken away by farmers who have been farming on these hills for over 2,000 years. It depends very much on where you're looking. Are you working in an area where there's been a lot of erosion, where there's hill slope, there's more surviving stone and mud brick, but we did excavate the trace of the eastern fortification wall, which was a mud brick wall, and on a rather preliminary rubble stone foundation, but there certainly were traces. So I'm not quite sure whether that answers the question fully, but
well, it's a very good start. Thanks very much. Then the first question, as you rightly said, from Dr. Colin Runnicles, is there any evidence whereby occupants of standard size houses perhaps got a little bit greedy and wanted to take over their neighbor's space? Do you have any evidence of that sort of sociological interpretation of data?
Yes, I mean this is where we really have to go back to the Johns Hopkins project, and Nicholas Cahill in his 2002 book Household and City Organizations, Olynthos, which I have a copy of here ready at my elbow, reports that there are three properties where the owners essentially extended into the neighboring house without in any way altering the wall foundations. So part of the neighboring house was incorporated into a new property with rearrangement of the interior spaces, but only 3 out of over 100 properties show some evidence of that. So it seems to have been rather small scale.
Thank you very much indeed. Then if I may move on to Julia. We have a question from Simon Braley or Braley. Did Roman women donate their personal property for religious purposes before Christianity became an important religion?
Yeah, very good question. Well, I think there is some evidence. I think there is a passage in Pliny about Livia giving a favorite jewel to the Capitoline Temple. And interestingly, there are some inscriptions from Spain that talk about the quest of jewelry to decorate statues of Isis, for example. Actually, I don't know whether it's just Isis or I'll have to look that up. And it's interesting because in terms of kind of public display of jewelry, classical Roman women were not supposed to do it, while it becomes much more acceptable in late antiquity. But goddesses, or the statues of goddesses, were often decorated with jewelry. So, but it's very kind of there's very few kind of textual evidence about it, and there's certainly no legacy hunting connected to that. I mean, there's a lot of kind of legacy hunting critique in particularly in satire in kind of classical times, but it's not connected to this kind of giving away for religious purposes. So so I'm not entirely sure, but there is a very good interesting anecdote from late antiquity about Serena, the sister of Honorius, who might actually be the woman who's shown on the Monza diptych, who goes into a temple in Rome of Magna Mater and takes away the necklace of the goddess and puts it on her own, kind of, well, you know, on herself. And then obviously it's, well, she's later she dies, so she's executed and so on. So it's kind of by the pagans, they love that, the pagan writers, that it was like a punishment. So there is some kind of reverse idea going on, which might, you know, actually tell us that that is what was happening. But yeah, and then I'm not really a kind of a classicist in that sense, so I don't know those texts too well. Maybe Tim knows.
Do you want to come in, Tim? Not particularly.
Sorry, I put you on the spot, but I don't know either. So maybe there is.
I'm not sure. I really don't.
Well, let me move on. I'd like to ask you a question myself, if I may. These wonderful jewels, obviously in public, that's what we call conspicuous consumption. Greek houses, this is now, of course, a huge generalization, late antique Greek houses were typically gendered spaces, and it was not normal for unrelated males to enter the house of another person, even a kin, and to view the women of the household in an everyday space. So Greek women, as I understand it, I stand to be corrected, would not normally invest, I use that metaphorically, in jewelry for private display within their houses in a way that clearly some very wealthy Roman women of very high status in late antique period, maybe earlier, did. Is there any, in your view, thought about how Greek women might or might not have differentiated themselves through jewelry? We've got a terrific amount of jewelry dedicated to goddesses. We have statues, as you say, of ordinary women as well as divine figures wearing jewelry. But I wondered whether you had any thoughts about whether this distinguished Roman, late Roman maybe, from Greek culture.
Well, I don't know about Greek women, and this is actually, yeah, I have to, thank you for letting me know, because I have to think about that a little bit more. So my understanding about earlier Roman women is that, so the critique of going into public bejeweled is just massive. And the representation, so aristocratic women, you know, in statuary, for example, even though there is a bit of, you know, maybe they had like real jewels on them and so on, but I think most art historians would say, no, actually the ideal was to look really modest and really plain and sober and so on, but they had jewels, and that I find that really kind of this dissonance of you could own them, but you could not show them, quite fascinating. Maybe that is true for Greece as well, I don't know, but then in late antiquity, there seems to be the big shift that you could also show them. So for example, empresses from about the late 3rd century on appear on coins with earrings and necklaces and so on, while, you know, you wouldn't have seen any earlier Roman empress bejeweled on a coin. So I think, you know, like the floodgates open, as it were, and then they become really a way of not just conspicuous consumption. I think that's what the point I want to make, but a real status marker, kind of official status marker, and not just, you know, within, you know, kind of private circles. You know, obviously, I'm sure there was a lot of competition going on in earlier Roman times, but these kind of, you can wear these jewels and you can wear those jewels that the emperor regulated. So I think those are kind of the big developments, apparently. Very and yeah, but if Greek women had jewelry as well, I mean, they have economic value, I suppose.
Yes, and dowry and trousseau.
Yes, yeah. So
really private
as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much. If I could move on then to Pim, and if I could just
can I be very rude and come in here just for a moment, please, and mention the repeal of the Oppian Law.
Yes.
Livy, chapter 34, and this is a specific case study that I use in teaching, in fact, there is the discussion, you know, about clothing and jewelry,
Yes.
and should they be allowed to have this? And the women do not speak, but there they are in the street, getting angry and showing off. And one of the arguments there is very much about why shouldn't Roman women be allowed to wear clothing and jewelry just like their neighbors from Central Italy and from other cities. So this is, I mean, obviously this is an artificial tableau created by Livy representing the various views, and you know what it means historically is questionable, but clearly the expectation is that women will be wearing jewelry for display purposes. But in terms of Greek women, well, one only has to think about red figure pottery, or the women sitting in their little, I mean, they may be sitting at home with their jewelry boxes, but they're wearing jewelry.
Oh, yes.
I mean, you know, they're wearing it for someone somewhere.
Yes, for someone somewhere.
For someone somewhere.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you because we've only got a couple of minutes left. So, Pim, if I could direct the next couple of questions to you, if you would mind unmuting yourself, if you are still there. Perhaps Pim's disappeared.
Dear.
It was very, very early for her, and sometimes the audio wasn't. Oh, here we go. Pim, can you hear me?
I'm here, but it's yes, I can, but it's very bad connection. And,
that's right. Well, you came and went during your talk, at least as far as I was concerned. And thank you so much for getting up and doing all this. Let me then very quickly, you mentioned different uses of pottery in different houses. Are there also data on different uses of pottery in different spaces in the same house, which might reflect different usage by different members of the family or by servants, slaves, as opposed to the free inhabitants? I think we may have lost the connection. One of those things. Yeah, she's somewhere in the bottom of a fish pond or a tank. It's a shame. But I was going to ask you, all three of you, the same question to end. And so maybe the two of you who are still there, Zosia, and Julia, in terms of the data, we've been talking about what we have, but what sort of a percentage is it of what there was out there? So really, what kinds of conclusions, or how strong can our generalizations possibly be given that? Certainly in terms of material evidence, it's sometimes thought we have only 1% of the actual original population of Greek pots out there once being used at any one time. 1%. Anyway, if either of you or any three of you, hello again, Pim, would like to have a quick crack at that, a final word would be great.
I think the question, I looked at the questions quickly and then they disappeared. Somebody was asking whether we could look at different rooms within the house.
Yeah.
It's hard enough just to get the data to look at the house without looking at the different rooms. But I published a paper 2009 where I looked at where the tablewares were found around the house of the Menander, and they don't appear in sets. The sigillata doesn't appear in sets, and I wrote a paper about the fact that I don't think the family ate together. You know, we hear about the dinner parties, and I think it's Lucullus came home one night and his servant said to him, "Oh, I didn't think you were dining tonight." And he said, "Well, tonight Lucullus was dining with Lucullus." So, you know, there was no food prepared because he wasn't having a dinner party. So I sort of feel that people kind of had more like, you know, food was brought to them wherever they had it. There wasn't a family meal. So that's just looking at the Inch of the Menander and whether we can find those sorts of, you know, we need a disaster where all the plates are really left on the table, which is not really the case in Pompeii, to do that kind of refined work. The other question, can I answer these questions while I'm on it, was about the residue analysis. And that was something we looked at in the big data on the Roman table, but we've now refined this archive scan project is really just looking at artificial intelligence. But that's certainly an area that is covered in the Big Data and the Roman Table project.
Thanks very much.
Have I answered?
Absolutely great. I'm going to hand you all back to Tim to wrap up. And obviously write to, if you've got further questions, do email any of the participants. And thank you all from me. Heartfelt thanks.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Well, I think we've just been treated to a wonderful series of papers which go from the house as a structure, where Zosia has talked about the construction of these places and then how they fit together in insulae and so on, and then the social and political implications of that are tremendous. And then we move to the interior, and Tim's paper was just mind-blowing in the sense that the application of the method that she put out are extraordinary. That I mean, everyone knows that the problem with archaeology, well, one of the many problems, is that the reports don't relate to one another. Everybody reports in a different way, so you can't put the data from one site together with the data from another. And now we have this what's it called, ontological databases, which can somehow, I mean, you point a mobile phone at the thing and it can relate these things together. I mean, how on earth that works, I don't know. But the application of it, the further application beyond the world of pottery and tableware to almost anything else archaeological by this method is as I say, mind-blowing. And then we come down to the level of the personal decoration of jewelry and its meaning and symbolism, and the way that this tells us so much about actually the status of women and the relations of the household and society to religious institutions and so on, which we had in Julia's very penetrating paper. I think we've had an absolute treat, and I think I want, on your behalf, everyone, to thank our three speakers for giving us a really fabulous evening. And I just wish we could go for a drink, but we can do it in our own homes. And here's to you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Oh, thank you, Zosia.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure.
And it's heroic of you to get up at this time of the morning. I mean, I dread to think what time of day it is, but well done and thank you.
It's a bit of well, I thought it was going to be 6:30, but it was 5:30. I got the time wrong.
Oh goodness. It really is 12 hours. That's awful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I'll end this session now.
Okay.
So, but yeah, it was great. Thank you.
Yes, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.